Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, February 14th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Ukraine is using ammo faster than NATO can produce it. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Monday that Ukrainian forces are using significantly more ammunition than the alliance's members can produce, and this is putting a strain on Western military stockpiles. Stoltenberg said this ahead of a NATO defense ministers meeting that's going to be held in Brussels. He said, quote, "The war in Ukraine is consuming an enormous amount of munitions and depleting allied stockpiles. The current rate of Ukraine's ammunition expenditure is many times higher than our current rate of production, and this puts our defense industries under strain," end quote. Stoltenberg said that NATO needs to ramp up production and that the defense ministers meeting will focus on ways to increase their defense industrial capacity to keep arming Ukraine and also to replenish their own military stockpiles. So the US has sent an enormous number of artillery shells to Ukraine since the Russian invasion, specifically the 155 millimeter shell. The US has sent over 1 million of them to Ukraine or said or pledged that much at this point. That's a lot of ammunition, and the US is working to increase its production of this sort of ammunition by 500% over the next 2 years. That's huge. And this is not just to meet Ukraine's demand, but they also want to bring US military stockpiles to levels higher than they were before they started shipping things to Ukraine. But even with the U.S. and NATO's plans to increase production, it's not clear if this policy is sustainable. This policy of flooding Ukraine with weapons, if they're going to be able to do this, for how long are they going to be able to do this? Is the big question. And to offset the strain on NATO stockpiles, as I went over the other day, British and other Western arms makers want to start manufacturing weapons inside Ukraine, but something like that would take years to set up. And the factories could obviously be targeted by Russia if the war is still on at that point. Stoltenberg said that NATO is in a race of logistics to deliver equipment to Ukraine as Russia is making more gains in the Donbass. He said, quote, "Key capabilities like ammunition, fuel, and spare parts must reach Ukraine before Russia can seize the initiative on the battlefield," end quote. So Oleksiy Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister, he's still hanging in there despite the head of the Servant of the People's Party, which is Zelensky's party, saying that they were going to remove him. He's still hanging on, and he's going to attend this NATO defense minister meeting in Brussels on Tuesday, where he's going to likely push for fighter jets. Stoltenberg said that providing Ukraine with aircraft would be discussed at the meeting, but that he preferred to focus on weapons that Ukraine could use immediately, as training on fighter jets would take time. And while there has been no pledges of Western jets to Ukraine, the UK said that it's going to start training Ukrainians on how to fly NATO aircraft starting this spring. So they're gearing up to start giving them these jets. And this discussion of jets, it comes after a series of escalation in U.S. military support. Each new step brings NATO and Russia closer to a direct war, and this is something that Stoltenberg has previously warned could happen. He acknowledged in December the danger of this policy of arming Ukraine and supporting Ukraine in every which way that they are, especially when it comes to the U.S., giving them coordinates to launch their rocket strikes. Stoltenberg said in December that a full-blown war with Russia is a real possibility. He said things could go horribly wrong. But he still, keeps pushing this really dangerous policy. All right, the next one here, Ukrainian troops are training on Leopard tanks in Poland. So Ukrainian troops, they began training on the German-made Leopard tanks in Poland, and they put a demonstration on Monday for President Duda, the Polish president, and it was attended by reporters. There was a few reports on it. And the training for the Leopard tanks, it typically takes a few months, but the program in Poland is being expedited and is expected to be completed in 1 month. Currently, 105 Ukrainian troops who were pulled from the front lines in the Donbass are being trained by Polish, Canadian, and Norwegian instructors. Germany is expected to deliver Ukraine's first batch of Leopard tanks by April, while the US made Abrams tanks could take years before they arrive for Ukrainian forces to use on the battlefield. So Germany and Poland are sending the Leopard 2, and Ukraine is also due to eventually receive the older Leopard 1 models, depending on how many that can be refurbished. Apparently, there's 178, I believe, is a number of these Leopard 1s that, if they can be restored, Ukraine is going to get them. But again, this could take months and years. Duda hopes that the Leopards combined with the British Challenger 2 tanks, and Canada said that they're going to send 4 Leopard 2s. I believe Norway is also sending a very small amount. I couldn't find a number on that, though. But due to the Polish president, he's hoping that this is going to give Ukraine about 65 tanks in the near future to be able to use on the battlefield soon. And NATO is rushing to deliver Ukraine more advanced weapons as Russia is making gains in the battle around Bakhmut in Donetsk. Russia appears to be on the offensive now. This kind of long awaited major offensive appears to be starting, although it's not clear if it's full throttle yet, because this battle around Bakhmut has been raging for months. And I know around there it's still Russia, the Wagner forces, not so much Russian regular troops. But if you're watching on the video, you can see the map here from South Front and this town Soledar that Russia captured in mid-January. Since then, they've taken a lot of territory and they're continuing to encircle Bakhmut, where Ukraine has taken a lot of heavy losses defending that city. There's been comments from Western officials saying that they don't know if it's worth all this loss that Ukraine has taken to defend this city. But there's fighting going on elsewhere in the east and also in the south, but the main battle still seems to be around Bakhmut, although Stoltenberg said another thing he said Monday is that it looks like Russia began its big offensive, and Ukrainian officials have been warning that Russia amassed, hundreds of thousands of troops and that the offensive was coming any day now. And another sign that Russia might make some more territorial gains. The New York Times reported on Monday that Ukraine has banned civilians and aid groups from Bakhmut. And the report said that this move could be a prelude to a Ukrainian withdrawal from the city. And again, which Ukraine has taken very heavy losses defending. So as they're rushing to get these tanks, it looks like the momentum is definitely on Russia's side right now on the battlefield. And again, this could just be the start of this big offensive. We might see a big push over the next few weeks, before they're going to get those tanks in April. All right, the next one here. Russia says that NATO should hold an emergency summit over the Nord Stream sabotage. So Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman said over the weekend that NATO countries should hold an emergency summit over the sabotage of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines after a report from journalist Seymour Hersh said that U.S. Navy divers planted explosives on the pipelines. So this is Maria Zakharova. She said, quote, "There have been plenty of facts, pipeline explosions, motives, and indirect evidence obtained by journalists. So when will an emergency NATO summit gather to analyze the situation?" End quote. So since Hersh's bombshell report, which alleges that President Biden authorized the bombing of the pipelines, the response from Western governments has been muted. Of course, the White House and the CIA dismissed the report as fiction, even though the U.S. clearly had the motive, and Biden and Newland made threatening statements saying they were going to bring an end to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline before Russia invaded Ukraine. Something I forgot about, and I mentioned it when the pipelines were first sabotaged, was the fact that, so in Hersh's report, it says Norway cooperated with the U.S. on it, and it says on September 26th, so the U.S. Navy divers planted C4 explosives on the pipelines in June 2022 during NATO exercises known as Balt Ops. And that has a big implication, the fact that they were planting these explosions during these drills. Because think about how all the drills that the U.S. does around the world, just in the South China Sea the other day, if they sometimes use drills as cover to attack another country. another country's infrastructure. But anyway, so the story goes, according to Hirsch's report, that they planted the explosives in June 2022. And then on September 26th, 2022, a Norwegian surveillance plane, a P 8, dropped a sonar buoy in the area that detonated the blast. On September 27th, 2022, the next day, representatives from Poland, Denmark, and Norway inaugurated Baltic Pipe, which is another natural gas pipeline that carries gas from Norway to Poland via Denmark. So Norway christened this new pipeline the day after they allegedly dropped this sonar buoy. So it's just another, more evidence, motive, I should say. And for their part, though, I mentioned that the Norwegian government has also denied Hirsch's report. He also did his first interview on this on Radio War Nerd, Mark Ames's podcast, which is Patreon, usually behind a paywall, but they put that one out for free. I should have linked it in there, but you could find it, I'm sure, pretty easily on their Patreon, the War Nerd, I think it's called. But it's worth listening to, I think, what Hirsch has to say. All right, so the next one here. China says that the U.S. has sent 10 balloons over its territory since last year. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry on Monday says that the U.S. had sent 10 high-altitude balloons over Chinese airspace since last year, while refuting allegations that the Chinese balloon the U.S. shot down was a surveillance device. So this is Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin. He said, quote, U.S. balloons have often entered other countries' airspace illegally. Since last year, U.S. high-altitude balloons have flown over Chinese airspace over 10 times without authorization from China. The U.S. needs to reflect on its own behavior and change course rather than attacking others and stoking confrontation, end quote. So Wang did not specify whether China thought the balloons were used for surveillance purposes or if they were weather balloons. Like they say, the balloon that the U.S. shot down was a weather balloon that accidentally entered U.S. airspace. But in response to Wang's comments, the White House said that any claims that the U.S. has sent surveillance balloons into China were false. And while the U.S. denied it, there are indications that the U.S. might have deployed balloons against China recently. Back in July 2022, so not that long ago, Politico reported that the Pentagon was planning to deploy surveillance balloons to use against China and Russia. The report read, quote, the high-altitude inflatables flying at between 60,000 and 90,000 feet would be added to the Pentagon's extensive surveillance network and could eventually be used to track hypersonic weapons, end quote. And then in 2019, the Pentagon tested surveillance balloons by launching 25 inside the U.S. from South Dakota, although there was no indication that they were sent outside of the country. But the purpose of testing these balloons was to see if they could be used to provide surveillance for drug traffickers and what they call homeland security threats. Wang also mentioned the surveillance that the U.S. is conducting in the South China Sea, which are disputed waters that are mostly claimed by China. So I guess a lot of the areas where U.S. spy planes fly over China might consider it to be their own airspace. So Wang said that the U.S. had conducted 657 sorties over the South China Sea in 2022 and 64 sorties in January. Again, this is the South China Sea, so U.S. surveillance aircraft. And the 64 number, that was also confirmed by the South China Sea Probing Initiative, which is a think tank based in Beijing. But as far as I know, they use, open source information just to track these U.S. spy planes. So 64 surveillance flights over the South China Sea in January. And this increase, the U.S. has increased its military activity in the South China Sea, both by sending warships and increasing these surveillance flights, making an accident like the 2001 Hainan Island incident more likely. And since the balloon incident, dialogue between the U.S. and China has deteriorated again. So an accident like that, a collision, who knows what that could lead to right now. And Wang said that the U.S. decision to shoot down the balloon with an F-22 was an overreaction. So the F-22 was the first time an F-22 shot something down. It was a balloon. And Wang also pointed to other global surveillance conducted by the U.S., specifically the NSA, monitoring phones belonging to world leaders, including leaders of U.S. that lead countries that the U.S. is allied with. And this was revealed by Edward Snowden, and he called the U.S. the number one spy empire in the world. So it's interesting to see China now claiming 10 U.S. balloons were over its territory or in its airspace. Again, nothing specific really here from China, but then you also have the U.S. saying that the spy balloon that they shot down before that, it happened 4 other times that a similar Chinese balloon went over the U.S. So again, this stuff, it's really hard to know what's what in this situation. It's all very strange. But the next one here, well, just to discuss that again, it's possible that they both knew that they were sending these balloons. Say they both have them, whether they're weather balloons or spy balloons, and they just didn't really think it was a big deal. And then the U.S. shot one down. Who knows? But anyway, the next one here, a House committee is planning a trip to Taiwan to infuriate Beijing. So members of the newly formed House Committee on China are in talks about sending a delegation to Taiwan, knowing that it will infuriate Beijing and likely raise military tensions in the region. So the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party was formed on January 10th, after Republicans took majority control of the chamber. A senior member of the panel, Representative Rob Whitman, a Republican from Virginia, told Nikkei Asia that he and other committee members are considering making the trip to Taiwan. He said, quote, "We know that will infuriate the Chinese, but I think it's incredibly important for us to do that because you have to send the signal that we're strongly on the side of Taiwan," end quote. So there you have it. He knows it's going to be a provocation, but they're going to do it anyway. And House GOP leadership is also planning to visit Taiwan. Kevin McCarthy, as I've gone over, the House Speaker, and Michael McCall, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. McCall recently said he's planning to go in the spring, lead a delegation, and then McCarthy would go after that. And McCarthy is planning the trip, even though when Nancy Pelosi went, when she was the House Speaker last August, it provoked the largest ever Chinese military exercises around Taiwan. And Beijing has kept up the military pressure since. So they know what's going to happen. It's just going to increase China's pressure on Taiwan. But they're still planning it. And a senior Pentagon official told Nikkei that more congressional delegations visiting Taiwan will escalate military tensions. So the U.S. knows it. The Pentagon knows it. But, this is how they're going to justify more aid for Taiwan and more buildups in the Asia Pacific to provoke China some more. All right. So the next one, back to the whole UFO situation, which, I do think in a lot of ways this is a distraction to the Nord Stream stuff and other things going on, but it's something just worth covering, just so you know what they're saying right now. So the U.S. military says that it started shooting down UFOs after adjusting their radars, explaining why the U.S. military just shot down 3 unidentified flying objects. The commander of U.S. Northern Command, and he's also the commander of NORAD, said it was due to a radar adjustment that was made after a Chinese balloon was spotted over the U.S. So Air Force General Glenn Van Herk, who heads NORTHCOM and NORAD, told reporters Sunday that the adjustments that were made mean that the radars pick up slower and smaller objects that were previously filtered out as clutter. So he said, quote, "With some adjustments, we've been able to get a better categorization of radar tracks now. And that's why I think you're seeing these overall. Plus, there's a heightened alert to look for this information," end quote. So he's basically saying that these types of things were probably floating around or flying around before, and they just didn't notice them. And now they're noticing them and shooting them down, which just seems really dangerous to me. And I mentioned again the thing I went over yesterday, that the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, released a report in January that said there were 366 UFOs reported to the U.S. military in about a year and a half. And of those incidents, 163 were found to be balloons, 26 were drones, and 6 more were airborne clutter or birds. and the other 171 incidents have not yet been attributed. So again, this stuff seems to be common, and now they're shooting at it. Um, and with these three UFOs that they shot down, they shot one down Friday, one down Saturday, and one down Sunday, 3 days in a row. They did it a lot quicker than, with a lot less caution than they approached the Chinese balloon. Basically, a day after they were spotted, they shot them down. And the Pentagon tried to explain this, saying that they shot these things down more quickly because they were traveling at an altitude that endangered commercial aircraft, unlike the Chinese balloons. And it's not clear what they are. There was a Pentagon memo apparently that went around that described one of them as a small balloon, a small metallic balloon. So they could all be balloons. Maybe some of them could be personal drones that are just bigger than ones that I don't know. Who knows? Again, what's going on here? I just think we should see what they're saying and how they're trying to explain it. And I think it really raises the risk of, an accidental shoot down of an aircraft carrying people. I think that's definitely possible if they're doing this so quickly. And it also risks the possibility of debris hurting people on the ground. Just seems pretty reckless to start shooting this stuff down. And, a big part of the reason, forget the China, them adjusting their radar, I think is also just the pressure Biden came under to shoot down the balloon immediately. That was the reflexive response from a lot of Republicans in Congress and his political opponents, calling him weak because he didn't shoot it down right away. All right. Speaking of which, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Representative Turner, Republican Congressman Mike Turner, he's a House representative, called on the president to be trigger happy when it comes to shooting down unidentified objects. He made the statement after the White House ordered two objects to be shot down by American fighter jets. So he's from Ohio, this representative. He said, quote, "They do appear somewhat trigger happy, although this is certainly preferable to the permissive environment that they showed when the Chinese spy balloon was coming over some of our most sensitive sites. Obviously, I would prefer them to be trigger happy than to be permissive," end quote. So Kyle put in the dictionary definition of what it means to be trigger happy. It means that you're inclined to be irresponsible in matters that might precipitate war. I think that's a good definition. So he's basically saying that the administration should shoot first and ask questions later. And again, I think very dangerous. I think this is how you could end up, with something really bad happening. So hopefully they cool off a bit after, these 3 days of shooting things down. All right. So the last news story here, another U.S. airstrike in Somalia. U.S. Africa Command said Sunday that it launched an airstrike against al-Shabaab in Somalia on February 10th, the first known U.S. airstrike in the country this month. The command claimed that the strike killed 12 al-Shabaab fighters and said it assessed that no civilians were harmed due to the remote location. But again, as I always say, the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties. There's no reason to believe them on this. And there's no accountability for this war because it receives very little media coverage. This airstrike, actually, I saw there was a write-up about it in Fox News and CNN, just online, probably no coverage on the TV or anything. But they were basically just the same as the AFRICOM press release. They just take their word for everything and just repeat what AFRICOM said. And unfortunately, that's all I have to work with is the AFRICOM press releases. But at least I just have to introduce some healthy skepticism there. So AFRICOM said that the strike was carried out near the coastal Somali town of Hobyo, which is almost 300 miles northeast of Mogadishu. So it puts it in about central-ish coastal Somalia, which is where a lot of the fighting has been going on between the U.S.-backed government and al-Shabaab. AFRICOM said that they did it in defense of the U.S.-backed government. That's how they call it, collective self-defense. I don't know that's how they justify drone strikes outside of Iraq and Syria, unless anything else has to be authorized by the White House, unless the person that they kill is on a presidential kill list. So U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, they continue to, increase. In January of this year, 3 airstrikes were reported in Somalia, and the U.S. also said it carried out a raid against an ISIS leader in Somalia, killing him and 10 of his associates. Again, the report on that is very vague and just so few details about this. Again, and also about U.S. operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and also across Africa. I mean, there's U.S. special ops going on all over the place in Africa, and we don't know what's happening, and there's very few people that really cover it. And the U.S. military, they portray al-Shabaab as this major threat due to its size and affiliation with al-Qaeda, but it's widely believed and recognized that the group is not a global threat. They don't have ambitions outside of Somalia. And as far as their al-Qaeda affiliation, al-Shabaab was born out of a U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion of Somalia that ousted the Islamic Courts Union, which was a coalition of Muslim leaders. And al-Shabaab was kind of the more extreme radical ones. And then after the invasion, they were radicalized some more. And the first recorded al-Shabaab attack was in 2007 against Ethiopian occupation troops in Mogadishu. And then it wasn't until 2012, after years of fighting, the U.S. and its proxies, that al-Shabaab declared loyalty to al-Qaeda. That is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. A lot of really good ones, as always. One from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies. How spin and lies fuel a bloody war of attrition in Ukraine. One from Ron Paul about the rally that is coming up. How can we stop the coming war with Russia? And here he says Ron Paul is actually traveling to D.C. to speak at this event that we are sponsoring. We're a sponsor, the Rage Against the War Machine rally. It is going to be held this Sunday, February 19th. I believe it starts at 12:30 p.m. at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of great speakers. Scott Horton's going to be speaking, Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, Tulsi Gabbard, Judge Knapp, Daniel McAdams. I know Max Blumenthal is going to be there, Jimmy Dore. There's a lot of people, and you should go too if you can make it. And there's also going to be some sister rallies in other cities. I know Eric Garris is involved in organizing one in San Francisco. So if you're in San Francisco, you could go to the website, the Rage Against the War Machine website, and they have information about all this stuff there. RageAgainstWar.com. We have one from Thomas Knapp about Matt Gaetz's Ukraine war resolution. We have one from Bruce Fine writing over at Consortium News, The Calamity of America's Divine Mission. And one from Brett Wilkins, the Pat Tillman story was hijacked during the Super Bowl, which I think is important because apparently I didn't watch the Super Bowl, but there was a little segment about Pat Tillman because he's from Arizona. He gave up his NFL career to join the U.S. Army Rangers, became very critical of the Iraqi invasion, and then was killed by friendly fire in an incident that the U.S. military covered up. That wasn't mentioned in any of the Super Bowl coverage, of course. They just said that he was killed in the line of duty. So I think that's an important thing to clear up. Unfortunately, I enjoy watching sports, but they usually, especially the NFL, there's a lot of propaganda, pro-military stuff involved there. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. You can go to antiwar.com/donate if you want to support us. Another way to support us is to just tell people about the site, tell people about this show, share it around, like and subscribe on YouTube. If you listen to the audio version, leave a review, leave a rating. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.